Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Independent Sage Friday briefing. Now, on Monday, the government announced that it would delay the easing of restrictions in England for 4 weeks, with cases of the Delta variant still high in many parts of the country. It judged that the 21st of June would be too soon to relax the measures in place to ensure our safety. Now, though this has come as a disappointment to many, there is reason for optimism. 80% of adults in the UK have had their first dose of the jab, and from today, over 18s will be able to book their first shot. However, as Independent Sage has repeatedly urged, now is not the time to be complacent. We must proceed with caution. The government has placed an emphasis on personal responsibility for keeping cases under control. But Independent Sage believes that this must be backed up by practical and financial support to help people to keep following mitigation measures. Independent Sage has released a new report today on the continuing need for measures such as financial support for self-isolation. This report is available to read on our website. As ever, we have a lot to get through, and we're constrained to 1 hour exactly today, but we're going to start with the latest figures from Dr. Kit Yates. Kit, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jim. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Latest numbers today. I'm going to talk about cases and hospitalizations, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on talking about a bit of a deeper dive, because we've got a little bit of time today, into the link between cases and hospitalizations and how that's changed over time as we've vaccinated people, and how we can expect that to evolve in the future, and how serious rises in cases actually are. And then I'll finish by talking a little bit about vaccinations and where we are with the vaccination program. So firstly, onto cases. This is going all the way back to September. Obviously, cases still low in comparison to the huge peak we saw in January, but currently rising quite significantly. If we zoom in, you can see that we're at the highest rates we've been at since mid-February now. So yesterday, this is reported cases. Yesterday, we reported over 11,000 cases. So the green lines here, green bars are the confirmed cases. Because there's a bit of weekly fluctuation, we do a 7-day average. That black line there you can see is a bit smoother, but is rising fairly consistently. If we look at cases per 100,000 per week for each of the home nations, you can see that they're actually all rising now. So Northern Ireland had been bucking that trend, whereas the other 3 nations were rising, but now they're all rising. Of course, Scotland has seemed to have started this third wave slightly earlier than the other 4 nations, and similarly England is catching up with that. So we have a little way to go, but we're rising quite quickly at the moment, and Northern Ireland are going to be catching up with that, I think, as Delta starts to take over there. It's currently only about 25% of the cases in Northern Ireland at the moment. Just to check that isn't just entirely due to testing increases. You can see that there are rises in Wales, Scotland and England in positivity. So that's when we divide the number of positives by the number of cases, by the number of tests that have been carried out. This is just for PCR tests. But you can see that actually Northern Ireland still appears to be dipping in this positivity data. So their rises might be an artifact of testing, but the other 3 nations, you can see there's clear rises in positivity as well as in cases. Looking at English regions, this is again cases per 100,000. You can see that cases are rising across all English regions now, particularly quickly, and rates are particularly high in the Northwest. Again, if we look at the positivity data, you can see the Northwest, which is in dark blue here, that's snuck over this 5% level of positivity, which is of course worrying, although there are signs that might be leveling off slightly recently. If we look at positivity rates for the English regions, again, this is just showing you last week in grey and this week in orange. They're ordered by rates of positivity, and you can see that the Northwest, Yorkshire and Humber, and the Northeast have all seen big rises. These are the 3 highest percentages, the highest positivity rates, but we've also seen rises across all of the regions, and in particular the Southwest in Cornwall has seen a big rise over the last week as well. this is the map that I've been showing for the last few weeks of case rates for different regions in the UK. This was on the 28th of May. You can see this was 2 weeks later on the 10th of June. This was last week. You can see that cases were spreading out and more areas becoming red and black. And again, you can see that the black, which is case rates of over 45 per 100,000 per week, have spread. Northwest is extremely high, northeast as well, and parts of London are seeing extremely high case rates now. So you can see this still spreading out across the country from this central belt where the main conurbations of the country lie. In terms of hospitalizations, are these cases translating into hospitalizations? This is the picture from September to June. So again, to put this in perspective, hospitalization rates are low in comparison to the peaks that we saw both last March and in January of this year, which were extremely high and put the NHS under a great deal of pressure. We're still at relatively low rates, but of course, if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that things can get out of hand quite quickly if you do nothing to control the spread of the disease. So just zooming in, this is from the 1st of March up to the 14th of June. This is just for England. You can see that hospital admissions have been rising, and they will continue to rise, reflecting the rises in cases. Again, for Scotland, they're a little bit further ahead in this wave, and you can see that their hospital admissions are rising similarly at the moment. So the question is, are these cases going to continue to translate into hospitalization? So this is an extract from the SAGE minutes from the 92nd meeting of SAGE, which came out last week. And it says, while the proportion of cases that result in hospitalization has decreased significantly due to vaccination, the number of infections and hospitalizations are still linked. So we haven't completely broken that link between hospitalizations and cases. And they suggest that if the number of cases double and that the age distribution of cases doesn't change, a week or so later, you'd expect the number of hospitalizations to double, although it's not entirely clear how this relationship will continue into the future. But this is what they're suggesting at the moment, that there's some constant rate of hospitalizations per case. Can we find out a bit more about that? Well, this is from the latest SPI-M summaries. This is the modelling subgroup of SAGE. They suggest the relationship between cases and hospitalizations has changed, however, it isn't entirely broken. So that's reflecting what the SAGE minute said. But they say that the ratio of confirmed cases to hospital admissions has been roughly stable since the start of April. So it suggests, exactly as the SAGE minute said, that if you see a doubling in cases, then you would expect to see a doubling in hospitalizations. So it implies that a rapid increase in cases will lead to a rapid rise in admissions. And as supporting evidence, they put a reference to this figure 1. So I've reproduced that here. This is when you divide the number of cases by the number of hospitalizations 10 days later. So we know that there's an offset between people getting infected, then people testing positive, and then a further offset between people testing positive and appearing in the reported figures and people reporting or appearing in the hospitalization figures. And so what SPI-M is suggesting is that this has dropped from 100 per 1,000, so roughly 10% back in January, down to between 4 and 5%, and it stayed roughly stable since the start of April. We would hope to see, as vaccination plays a bigger and bigger role, that this will continue to drop, but that isn't necessarily what this figure suggests. The reason why this is a sensible thing to do is, well, there's sort of caveats around this. So if you offset the number of cases shown here in blue, which corresponds to the left-hand axis here, and the number of hospitalizations by 10 days, so I've shoved the brown curve back across here this way to make it match with the cases, you can see that it does an okay job. We're roughly expecting cases to translate into hospitalizations. It's a fairly decent fit with this 10-day delay. And if you look at more recently, it's not the best fit, but you can see it hospitalizations tracking down as cases track down and then starting to rise as cases started to rise. And so when you divide the brown curve by the blue curve, you get exactly this figure that the SPI-M reproduced, which is the percentage of hospitalizations per case, and it seems to be staying roughly stable. The problem with doing this relatively simple analysis is that there isn't a fixed period between the time when people get infected and appear in the case data and then appear in the hospitalization data. In fact, there's actually a distribution of time weights, of lags, if you like, between people appearing in cases and appearing in the hospitalization data. Some people it might take 10 days, some people it might take 9 or 8 or 7, or some people it might take longer, it might take 11 or 12. And actually, different delays give you a slightly different version of this picture and suggests a different link between hospitalizations and cases. So if we look at a delay of 8 days instead of 10 days, I think this actually gives a slightly better agreement between the brown curve and the blue curve. This is for all the data back to about a year ago in August. This is for data just from March onwards. I think this gives actually a better fit between hospitalizations and cases, a delay of 8 days. If you use that delay of 8 days, then actually you can see that it doesn't look like this link is constant anymore. It looks like it's actually dropping a little bit, which is good news. It suggests that the link between hospitalizations and cases is slowly being broken. Similarly, if you use a 6-day delay, it's maybe stretching it, the agreement probably isn't quite as good now between hospitalizations and cases when you offset by only 6 days. Again, here it's probably not quite as good in the more recent data either, but that suggests an even steeper decline in this link. So actually, it's not entirely clear what's happening with this link between hospitalizations and cases. Really, we need to do something clever mathematically called a convolution. But this way of just offsetting is a slightly crude method, and it's very sensitive to the delay which you use. So hopefully we'll see something like this, where the link between hospitalizations and cases comes down over time. But at the moment, SPI-M is suggesting that's staying roughly constant. But that's something we really need to keep our eye on as we go forward. The last thing I want to touch on is vaccination data. So this is, again, showing total number of doses, a moving 7-day average in grey. Orange here is second doses and blue is first doses. And you can see, disappointingly, we had this dip for the late May bank holiday, and then things rose a little bit. But actually, we've seen a decline again over the last week or so, which is really disappointing, because this is the time we've had this 4-week delay, a sort of reprieve, when we need to do everything we can to try to stop the spread of the disease. So that doesn't just include vaccination, that includes all sorts of other interventions that we always talk about. But vaccination is one of the tools we have, and it's disappointing to see that the rate of vaccination has dropped off to its lowest level for quite a while, when we actually need it to be accelerating. If you look at the proportions of people in each of the 4 nations who have been vaccinated with either 1 dose, which is in blue, 2 doses in orange, and completely unvaccinated in grey, this is as a proportion of the total population, so including children. You can see that around 55%, at least over 50% of the population of each of the home nations have not been double vaccinated, so have not got the full protection. And we know that getting full protection against this Delta variant is incredibly important, because 2 doses provides much better protection than a single dose. So we still have over 50% of the population who aren't double vaccinated. So we need to keep this going. We really need to up these figures as much as possible. It paints a slightly rosier picture when you just look at vaccinations as a proportion of adults. So we're now up at 80% of adults having their first dose and 58% of adults having their second dose. This is good news, but of course, as we discussed last week on Independence Age, children can transmit the virus, and children can be affected by the virus, both through getting the disease and also through long COVID. So we really need to be thinking about vaccinating children, and these figures paint slightly too rosy a picture, I think, in terms of where we are in terms of our vaccination program. Just looking across the nations, again, this is a proportion of adults. You can see Wales is well ahead in terms of their first dose delivery. They're running close to the edge in terms of their vaccine supply, but that's meaning that they are getting first doses into arms faster. And then in terms of second doses, where all 4 home nations are roughly equal, although Northern Ireland is lagging behind on both first and second doses at the moment, so they can hopefully pick up their game if possible. The last thing that we don't always manage to fit in, but I think is really important to cover, is looking at first dose coverage by ethnicity, and you can see that there's a clear gradient between white people who are most vaccinated and black people who are the least vaccinated in terms of first dose coverage for over 50s. The reason it's over 50s is because we would have expected everyone over 50 to have been at least offered their vaccine by now. So there's a clear disparity in uptake, and that's something we really need to try to address. Similarly, for second doses, we need to be a little bit more careful about this, because different age distributions in the over 50s might mean that these aren't quite comparable figures, but we're almost there with offering everyone over 50 their second dose. So these figures won't change too much over the coming weeks. And again, you can see that there's this clear disparity by ethnicity. And that's something that we really need to try to address, unless we're happy with pockets of unvaccinated people and potentially outbreaks in those communities. This is something that I think we'd like to try to avoid. So we need to do everything we can to try to tackle this vaccine hesitancy. So just to summarize then, cases are continuing to rise relatively quickly, although there have been some signs of slowing down. Hospital admissions are accelerating, matching the rises in cases a couple of weeks earlier. Vaccination, unfortunately, seems to be slowing down, and we still have over 50% of the population who are not fully protected. And as we approach in 3 or 4 weeks' time, the next potential unlocking date on the 19th of July, we really need to do everything we can to try to make sure as many people as possible are protected. And of course, as to highlight, there are still significant disparities in vaccination by ethnicity, which really need to be addressed. Okay, so that's it from me. I'm going to hand back to Jim. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kit, for that. Okay, so we're now going to take some questions from the press and the public. And first up on my list is Mark Bloomfield. Yes, Mark, you are there. So do you want to ask your question, please?
Okay, so my question is delaying lockdown easing going to be enough to avoid another wave? And looking at Kit's slide earlier, with the Delta variant taking hold in many parts of the country, is relying on vaccination going to hold the variant at bay, or should the government have reintroduced some of the previous lockdown measures?
Steve Reicher, do you want to have a first stab at that?
I finally managed to unmute myself.
Excellent.
The problem, I think, in answering this question is that people think that any measures equate to lockdown measures. And there are many things we should be doing which have got nothing to do with restricting people and everything to do with supporting people. And these are the basics, which haven't been done throughout because this government hasn't been doing enough to support people to do the things that are necessary to suppress infection. And we list a series of those in our document we put out a couple of weeks ago about what should be done in relationship to the roadmap. And there are a number of very sensible things. So, for instance, it's improving the testing system. We've always talked about this, improving the amount of contact tracers that we have, and making sure that they're local, they know their patch, that they can go to people, that if phones aren't answered, they can knock on doors and so on. So we pick up cases. And then it's about probably the biggest gap in the whole pandemic response, which is the lack of support for self-isolation. We should be putting in much more support for self-isolation. At the moment, we give a measly 500 quid. 1 in 8 people is eligible, and of those who apply, only about a third of people actually get the money. We should be having comprehensive financial support, accommodation support, other forms of support, including emotional support. That's not being done. That could be far better. And when it comes not to dealing with outbreaks, but stopping us getting infected, we should be doing things like giving grants to businesses and homes so we can have better ventilation, making sure there is inspection of premises to make sure they are safe, putting that information up on the web so people can look around themselves and see if I want to go to a restaurant or I want to go to a bar, which ones have got those standards. And that's being done around the world. If you look on the internet, if you look at Pennsylvania, for instance, that's precisely what they should be doing. So those basics of infection control and of outbreak control, which should have been done a year ago, still aren't being done. And that's what we should be doing. And those are the things which will stop us having to go back into lockdown. We want to stop lockdown. And if you don't do the basics to stop infection, that's the direction in which you will be going. So to use a slogan, which hopefully the government will recognize and might even like, let's go back to basics and get the basics right. And that's absolutely critical to stop us having to do the things that nobody wants, like go back to the days of February and March this year.
Thank you, Steve. Anthony Costello, yeah.
Thank you. Just to back up what Steve says, we're at the very beginning of this whole thing last March, we were told you can't suppress this virus. And yet already most of the Asian states, China, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, blah, 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 had suppressed it within about a month with the public health measures that Stephen said. Then they said from SAGE, well, even if you can suppress it, all these countries are going to have a massive second surge. And this week I tweeted the pictures of the deaths and cases. And in all of the Asian states, they've had some small surges, but they've, again, completely suppressed them using public health measures. And their death rates are hundreds of times lower than ours. And, I've been involved, we have to learn from overseas. I've been involved with more than 12 large-scale cluster randomized trials of how to mobilize populations in low-income settings, vulnerable populations. And we also know from immunization, from AIDS, from Ebola control, that community engagement is absolutely critical. And this will apply to vaccine hesitancy as well as preventing the spread of infection. And we simply haven't done that. And we haven't paid attention to population science. This is scientifically based evidence that has come out over the past 30 years. And yet we've ended up with, we knew call centers would fail from day one. You can't possibly manage an epidemic using call centers. If we were like China, we would have had 45,000 contact tracers on the ground from, early on. And we had 750,000 volunteers, none of which were used. So my argument, and all the argument of Indeed Sage, is we didn't need to be here. And this is the fourth time we've closed a national lockdown and are relentlessly seeing cases rise up again, albeit at a lower rate this time.
Thank you. Zubaida Haq, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thank you. I mean, as Anthony and Steve have rightly pointed out, it's just so frustrating we're back in this position. At the beginning of the week when the Prime Minister spoke again, literally the country, I think, including us, were relieved that he wasn't going to add fuel to the fire by going ahead with June the 21st. But of course, we've still got the fire to deal with. And there has been a complete deafening silence around that fire, other than talk about and targets around vaccinations. But as we've rightly pointed out, as everybody has pointed out already, vaccinations isn't going to be enough. And in schools, where that fire is the most intense right now, school-aged children have the highest rates of infection, and there are school outbreaks, hundreds of school outbreaks across the country, according to Public Health England reports. The real concern is, what are the mitigation measures there? Now, Boris Johnson took away face masks in secondary schools on May the 17th without sharing any of the data why, without any reason for why he took away your face mask. And that should be the first thing, Mark, that they reinstate. It was astonishing that the Prime Minister didn't say not only anything about schools, but he didn't reinstate face masks in secondary schools. Now, it's not just secondary schools that's a problem, it's also primary schools. So there are key questions around the mitigation measures, or at least the lack of mitigation measures in primary and secondary schools. And we really need something to be done about that. My colleague Steve has talked about ventilation. The government desperately need to look at ventilation and think about how they are going to ventilate classrooms better. We've got 5 weeks left of school. We don't want schools to close. We need children in schools. We need undisrupted education. We need children to be safe not be exposed to long COVID as well, let alone hospitalization. So we need the government to do much more about that.
Okay, thank you. Last comment before we move on to Kit.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I'll just say, Mark, I think we're already in this third wave. SAGE and SPIAM have suggested that this 4-week delay will maybe halve or reduce by a third the number of hospitalizations. So that is definitely a positive thing. But it depends what your tolerance is. If we let cases rise very high, then I've emphasized the link between hospitalizations, but we will also see cases of long COVID. And the only way that this wave is going to finish is if people get immunity. Now, whether that's through vaccination or whether that's through people getting infected depends on how quickly we vaccinate, but it also depends on how much we do, as Steve has suggested, to mitigate the spread in other ways. And we could be doing more to make sure that more people can get immunity through vaccination and fewer through natural infection.
Thanks, Kit. Okay, so we now have a question from Nigel Nelson from the Sunday Mirror.
Thanks very much, Jim. The reports coming out of Russia that there is a new Moscow variant on the loose. How worried are you that we might be in for another kind of Delta thing, but this time from Russia?
Okay, I know we're sort of already halfway through the Greek alphabet in terms of variants. Gabriel Scally, maybe.
Am I surprised? No, we need to get used to this. I think we are going to see variants arising as long as there are very large numbers of cases across the world. The more the virus replicates, the more mutations it will throw up, and the greater chance there is of some of those being really dangerous. So it's good that genomic sequencing is being done more often across the world. There are still big gaps in that. So improving genomic sequencing across the world is extremely important to keep an eye on these. But the most important thing has to be vaccination across the world. We are going to be in a position where we're one of the countries that is well vaccinated, and we're seeing large benefit from that, very substantial benefit. But a large proportion of that benefit could be undone potentially by a variant that manages to combine two things, manages to combine the infectiousness of the Delta variant with the vaccine dodging ability of either a new mutation or, for example, the South African variant, where, as you know, the AstraZeneca vaccine isn't particularly potent against that particular variant. So, Nigel, we are going to have to get used to this serial variants being produced across the world. So what would Independent Sage say about that? Well, we would say that there are two things. Firstly, we should be supporting the vaccine waiver, the patent waiver for production of vaccines, substantially increasing the output of vaccines across the world to make sure as many countries get up to a high level of vaccination as possible, as soon as possible. And the second thing, we should be preparing ourselves for what we will do when we inevitably get variants coming our way over the next period of time. And it's some of the things that that Stephen Reicher was saying earlier that need to be done in terms of strengthening our local public health teams, strengthening their ability to respond to flare-ups and outbreaks, to suppress them totally. We can't have the half-baked measures that have been in place in Blackburn and Bolton, where local directors of public health pleading for vaccination in their local areas to try and suppress the numbers. We can't have that. We have to have testing of close contacts. They're the people most at risk of people who've tested positive. And we are way out of line internationally. We do not test the people most at risk of getting COVID-19. And those are the people who are close contacts of people who've already tested positive. We tell them to self-isolate, and we know that that doesn't work terribly well. As Stephen said, the support isn't there to make it effective, but we should be testing. So there are a string of things that we need to do to get ourselves in a position to combat a Moscow variant or any other variant that comes our way.
Thanks, Gabriel. Thank you for your question, Nigel. Okay, next question from Rebecca Payne.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about the modelling. So after Boris Johnson's press conference, a great deal of modelling was released and it showed cases peaking over the summer. Well, my question is how confident can we be that cases will naturally peak? Because it seems both in the UK and worldwide, it's taken significant interventions, or be they public health interventions, lockdown and the like, to get case numbers down. Can we be confident that these models will are correct and that case numbers, even if we let them get high over the summer, will come down on their own without further intervention other than the vaccine rollout?
Who'd like to have a stab at that? Kit, yeah.
Yeah, I think we can be relatively confident that cases will come down. The way that this will end and the way this may become endemic at low levels is when we have high enough immunity in the population. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that can come in two different ways. It can come through people getting infected, or it can come through people getting vaccinated. So it is to some degree a race between those two things. The more we can slow down the natural course of infection, the better. The faster we can vaccinate, the better. But yeah, the modelling suggests that we will see a peak to this, and it will come down. And the more people we vaccinate, the less room there will be for the virus to spread to susceptible people. But if we often talk about herd immunity thresholds. In some senses, they're not the best idea, because if we leave a large proportion of the population, for example, under 18s, unvaccinated, then there'll always be the possibility that we'll see outbreaks in those populations. So it suggests maybe that we should be thinking hard about vaccinating children, given that the Pfizer jab's been approved for 12 to 17-year-olds in the UK, but that decision has yet to come from the JCVI. So yes, I think we will see this. And over the summer, I mean, there's uncertainty in the timing. It could take longer, it could take less time. But yes, I think we will see this come down eventually.
Thank you. Zubaida, you had your hand up. Did you want to?
Yes. Well, what I was going to say is we need to return, as we always do in the independent age, on the inequality dimension of this, which is that, rates will come down, but they're not going to come down equally. They're not going to come down equally across the country. And they certainly won't be coming down equally in relation to ethnic minority groups, different ethnic groups, as well as areas of deprivation versus more advantaged areas. And that's where I'm really, really concerned, because when you look at, for instance, the age distribution among ethnic minority groups, they are much younger than white British population. So approximately a quarter of Asian groups are under the age of 18. Half of the mixed ethnicity group are under the age of 18, which means that they won't be vaccinated in the next few months. And that's a real concern, because we know that those groups are right now more overexposed to the virus and less protected. So we need to think about that as well.
Thank you. Professor Carl Friston, did maybe you wanted to say something about this idea of endemic equilibrium? Some long-term leveling off, a bit like thermodynamic equilibrium, but not quite.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that. That's very astute of you. So just to answer the question directly, how confident can you be in the modelling? Just to, I think, put the modelling into two sort of classes. There's worst case scenario modelling, which is essential to apply the precautionary principle, and that's largely what the SPIM models offer the government. So you can be absolutely confident that it's unlikely to be worse than what you read in the newspapers when you're talking about predictions from particularly Warwick and Imperial. So that would be sort of, you could confidently say that you have built in enough uncertainty and unconfidence into this modelling to be reasonably assured it's not going to be worse than the forecasts of worst case scenarios will be. That means that, if you actually look at what is the most likely outcome, given the current trajectory of vaccinations, as Kit was referring to, that is going in the direction where it would make the possibility that the subsequent wave will not peak very, very small. So when one actually does this sort of convolution and deconvolution, we know that there's a partial break between case rates and hospitalization induced by vaccine, and that's proportional to the proportion of the population that are vaccinated, and we know that that is going to increase as time goes on. So we know that it will peak. I think that the interesting question which Jim referred to is what's going to happen after the peak. I think there is a choice here. Referring to the previous question about is vaccination sufficient? Well, of course it's not sufficient. However, if you didn't do anything else but just relied upon vaccination, it's looking as if we would run into an endemic equilibrium where we'd have to live with the virus. And by equilibrium, I don't mean the sort of equilibrium where it's just in the background in a tonic way. There will be seasonal fluctuations, so there will be not insubstantial waves every winter where a significant proportion of the population will die. And that will be the kind of endemic equilibrium that we will be living with. And I think most people think that we're sort of approaching that sort of game at the moment, and that sort of puts real pressure in terms of long-term strategies and whether we want that. There are other equilibria, and those are the ones that Gabriel was intimating, that if we put everything else into the mix in addition to vaccination, then you can get towards a much more suppressive kind of equilibrium, but that will require a different strategy than we're currently witnessing.
Thank you. Steve, yes.
I wanted to make a point, not about the modelling itself, but the way in which we communicate about the modelling and the way in which the modelling informs public understanding. Because one of the dangers is that because we don't go into the details of the mathematics and the assumptions, the modelling and the curves come over as if there's something that are going to happen, as if they are handed down somehow and that they are inevitable. And it's something that renders the public largely passive, waiting for something to happen to them or not. And when you look more closely, of course, you see there are a whole series of assumptions which have to go into these models, assumptions about the rate of vaccination, and critically, assumptions about our behavior. One of the most important factors in the models is what we actually do, whether we get tested when we're infected and do so quickly. And the data is showing us actually a remarkably low number of people do so, not least because people don't entirely realize what the symptoms are, especially for the new variant. Another factor that is absolutely critical goes back to this issue of self-isolation. If people don't self-isolate, there are huge differences. So the point is that these models aren't something that happens to us. They are dependent upon what we do. And what we do makes a huge difference to the models. And I think it's really important to communicate that to people, to show them what the consequences are of different types of behavior. So we need better communication. And we need better communication then, not only about how our behavior makes a difference, but what we should do. We haven't had the communication, for instance, about the symptoms of the new Delta variant and how quickly people should go and get tested. And again, and I come back to this point because it is in fact one of the most fundamental points, that if you want people to behave the right way, you need to give them the information, but you also need to give them the support. So for me, the model shouldn't be seen in terms of this is going to happen, but what can we do to alter the models so that the curves are lower and we come out of it better? And I think that form of communication is absolutely critical.
Thank you. I wanted to move on, but I appreciate something when we talk about behavior. Maybe Susan Mitchell, you might have something to add to this.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to add to what Steve was saying about the communication and people's understanding, because data is also showing that a high percentage of people who are symptomatic are getting lateral flow tests rather than PCR tests. Now, you can understand why. They're easy to get, they're free, they give you instant results. But the problem about people not realizing that these are not passports, that if you get a negative test result, that means you're not infectious, is that they'll do that, get a negative test result, assume they're not infectious when quite likely they are, and go about infecting other people. So that's a real big issue about communication, explaining to people what the difference is between these two tests, and not to use these lateral flows for permission to go about everyday business as if you haven't got the disease. So I think it's a really important issue and one that's not had much attention so far.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Rebecca, for your question. Generated a lot of response. Next question comes from Janet Newsham.
Hello. My question is about ventilation. So with the increased transmission risks of the new variant and it being an aerosol transmission in particular, wouldn't it be better to ensure that all inside spaces had a ventilation standard measurement associated with each room or area and visible to everybody, you know, on the website or on a notice, so that people can make a more informed decision about the precautions that they need to protect themselves, but also for enforcement authorities and workers to know what good ventilation should look like in each room or area? And should the government be providing CO2 monitors for all public and education buildings to use as an air quality proxy measure?
Thank you. We have a similar question from Ruth Parry. Ruth, do you want to ask your question as well? Because then we'll take the responses together.
Yes, hang on. Sorry.
I know you're repeating very much a similar question to Janet.
No, that's absolutely fine. Yes, so my question was just briefly, are CO2 meters useful for assessing ventilation adequacy of indoor rooms, for instance, educational rooms in universities, colleges, schools, and for sort of social indoor places like restaurants? And if CO2 meters are useful, what levels should be considered as more or less safe? Thanks.
Thank you both. Susan.
Thanks, really important issue. And having listened to a couple of presentations from Professor Kath Noakes from Leeds University, who's a world expert on ventilation, my understanding is that it's quite difficult to have really good measures of ventilation quality, but that CO2 monitors are as good a proxy as any. I also understand that Belgium has been introducing this quite routinely, so it has been done. So I think it's given that we know that aerosol transmission is of paramount importance, given that ventilation is one of the key things to reducing that transmission, it seems to me that this is a real area that should be focused on and should be invested in. In terms of criteria, I'm afraid I just don't have that expertise.
And yes, of course, I interviewed Kath Noakes on Life Scientific recently, and she talked about exactly this problem about just sitting near a window is not good enough if the air isn't flowing and being renewed. Putting in the perspex dividers between desks in an open plan office is bad rather than good, because it stagnates the air as well. So yeah, I think this an aspect needs looking into a bit more. Gabriel.
Yeah, I mean, as a public health doctor, I think it's fantastically important. One of the first things I must say, Janet, is one of the first things we must do is get over to the public that this virus is airborne. And I know that sounds, to us, that probably sounds a strange thing to say, but so many people still think that it's droplet spread, because that's what we were all taught at the beginning. And when I went to get my first vaccine, I got given an official leaflet, which talked about droplet spread. It was all about droplet spread. I see so many people, including seeing them on the media, journalists and all sorts of people, wearing visors, as if somehow that's going to protect them against an airborne disease. It's really, so my first basic thing would be public education, so that everyone understands that air is the main means of transmission. I still see places who take scrupulous care about cleaning seats every time you've sat on them and things like that, but still don't have adequate ventilation in them. So getting that knowledge firmly ingrained in everyone's head is the first thing. And the second thing, I absolutely agree about two things that you said. One is standards, and setting those standards is absolutely correct. And the way in which they are achieved in terms of the amount of air change taking place in our buildings is a technical issue. And I can't tell you what CO2 levels should be under any circumstances, on any range of circumstances, but they do need to be set. And we've got fantastic bodies more than capable of setting those standards. there are also legal requirements. The HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, says on his website that workers have a right to fresh air in their workplace. And that needs to be properly defined and properly enforced. And I also think that this issue about you being able to find out what the level is, someone was talking the other day about a restaurant. If you go to a restaurant, you can see what the hygiene rating of the restaurant is. We should have a ventilation minimum, and we should have excellence as well in that to try and get people to approve. And my final point is this one point. We've lost something along the way. The history of the last century. If you go back 100 years ago, we were building things on the basis of ventilation and sunlight as being extraordinarily important to the health of our population. I went to a primary school in a poorest part of Belfast, built in 1933, with no internal corridors, with hugely high ceilings in all the classrooms, opening windows, faced south to the sun, not onto the road as one would have normally thought. And the whole string of buildings, all of the public schools in Belfast at that time were built in exactly like that. And we've lost that idea that air and sunlight are really, really important to us, and outdoors as well. And the last outdoor school, I think in Bristol, where I live now, shut in the 1960s, but we used to have outdoor schools all over the country, and they weren't for super healthy outdoor kids. Those were for the most vulnerable kids, because we well understood the importance of air and sunlight and being outdoors. And we've got to rediscover that spirit as well. Thank you for the question, both of you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Well, we have just under 50 minutes left. We'll move on to a question from Peter Cooper. I've caught Peter off guard.
I'm here, but I can't start my video.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Just ask you. We can hear you.
Okay, here I am. Yes, sorry. My question is, given the estimated R number for the Delta variant, will the 60% effectiveness of the AstraZeneca vaccine be sufficient for the achievement of herd immunity from infection?
Carl Friston, maybe respond first.
Yes, great question, but in a way it's already been answered. So I'm just referring back to Kit's very scholarly observation that the notion of herd immunity may not be the most useful concept. And I think, if you listen to Dr. Anthony Fauci in the States, I think he makes a very similar point. It's a magical fantasy, which really has very little impact on what we actually do. But technically, it certainly is possible to reach a herd immunity threshold under the simplifying assumptions of technically what are called SIR models, even with a 60% efficacy of various vaccines. And that's because the efficacy is defined in many different ways. So you have to be extremely careful what you mean by efficacy. Do you mean the efficacy of precluding transmission, which is the key thing that would determine the herd immunity threshold, or do you mean the efficacy in terms of subsequently you becoming seriously ill? So most people at the moment are focusing on the efficacy of vaccination in relation to precluding illness, the pathogenicity. What we need to know from the point of view of the epidemiology and concepts like herd immunity threshold is the effectiveness of vaccination in preventing transmission, or communicating the virus to the next person. That's something of an unknown, but certainly our modeling, and this is a sort of convolution deconvolution modeling, not the scenario modeling, suggests that's actually quite high. So that's looking quite good. So when you commit to the estimates of that kind of efficacy, then it looks as though one could reach a herd immunity threshold if you thought that was important, imminently, but certainly by Christmas. Having said that, that target is a moving target because it depends upon fluctuations in transmissibility that depend upon the cocktail of variants that we're currently exposed to. And as you know, I think Gabriel was saying, that cocktail will just keep changes, and as you know, and we're going to run out of Greek numbers at some point. So you know, there are answers to your question, but I'm not sure that those answers are going to be terribly useful in terms of what we actually do and how strategically we respond to this.
Thank you, Carl. Anthony, did you want to come in?
Just very quickly, when we're talking about herd immunity and what do we mean by we? We're in a pandemic. 1% of Africa has been vaccinated. And at the moment, all of Africa is starting a winter surge. It's shooting up in South Africa, Zimbabwe, but now it's rippling out into other countries. And in Nepal, a country I know because I lived there and been there many times, they had vaccines coming in from India, but they've totally stopped. And they will not get any vaccines before 2022. And clearly we need more vaccines for the world to enable us to achieve global effective herd immunity. And to do that, we need more companies making it. And to do that, we need a patent waiver. That means that the patent on these vaccines should not be controlled by just 3 or 4 companies. And Joe Biden, to his credit, and Macron from France both agreed to a patent waiver at the G7 meeting. But Germany, Chancellor Merkel, and the UK, our Prime Minister, blocked it. And that means that 1 million people are dying roughly every 3 months, will continue to die. Gordon Brown called this an unforgivable moral failure. And Jonas Salk, back in 1956, he invented the polio vaccine. When he was asked, you know, why are you not patenting this? He said, can you patent the sun?
Very good point. Okay, in the interest of time, we have 2 more questions. Maybe just have one person respond to each. So the next question is from Tanya Ziegler.
My question, I'm a teacher, and given that the reality of our jobs is that we haven't got masks in schools and colleges, we haven't got decent ventilation, would you say what you think is best practice for us if we have a student who tests positive in a class in terms of how we isolate the rest of the class? Should we just do the 2 students either side? Should we isolate the whole class, or do you have any other suggestions?
Who would like to? The pressure's on because I said only one answer. You have to make it good and all-encompassing. I know, Zubaida, maybe.
I can have a stab at it. I mean, I can't say for sure what good practice is. I mean, the reality is we're talking about an airborne virus. So as much as we would want to limit the number of children in the classroom that need to self-isolate for 10 days to 2 weeks, it's an airborne virus. Schools are very poorly ventilated. I've just mentioned on the chat that a lot of schools don't even have windows that open properly. We've got approximately 30 children on average in each class. So, you know, so it does make sense to do the whole class as opposed to just the children around one child. But of course, Tanya, what's happening right now is there's some 200 schools involved in a government trial where they're using lateral flow tests to replace self-isolation. And the government are saying that close contacts of that infected child, even if that infected child has the Delta variant, which it's likely to now, don't need to isolate. They can take lateral flow tests until they're positive. But the government haven't considered the surrounding children at all, and they're not asking for consent in that trial. So actually the way the government's going on this is the opposite way of what's safe for children. And although children don't on average get seriously ill, we need to think about long COVID. We know that some 7 to 8% of children get long COVID. We need to think about school disruption, and more cases there are, the more children that are disrupted, the more school outbreaks you have. And we need to think about children's well-being here as well. It's not just about hospitalizations and it's not just about deaths. Thank you.
Thank you, Zubaida. Final question, so actually follow on from this last one from Megan Smith about adults rather than children in indoors. Megan.
Hello. Should employees in shared office spaces be wearing face coverings all the time, only when others are entering the space, depending on ventilation or depending on vaccination status?
Interesting. Susan.
I don't really want to be the only one answering this. But I think what we're looking at going forward is a really complicated situation where one's going to have to put together lots of different kinds of information in order to take a judgment about what's the best thing going to be in any one circumstance. So first of all, you have to think about your setting. And as you said, ventilation is an issue, but also you need to think about the total volume of airspace. As Gabriel said, it's very different if you're in a huge hall with very high ceilings compared to if you're in a room with a very low ceiling, for example. You also have to think about the people. How vulnerable are the people who are in that space? And then you have to think about the different mitigation measures and what you wear when. And I think the key thing here is that there's not going to be one rule that fits everything. Things are going to have to be adjusted to circumstances. But the two key things that are needed, one is good information so that people can make informed decisions about what's the best practice to do in any situation. And the other is good consultation and engagement and involvement of everybody concerned. So it's a joint understanding of what the options are, what the pros and cons of them are, and what in the circumstances are the best thing to do. And situations change. And so whatever the best situation at any one point in time, maybe not be the best situation forever. So the other thing is there should be as much monitoring as is possible in any situation, and regular reviewing and adjusting if needs be.
Thank you. Carl?
Yeah, just to highlight a key aspect of Susan's response. In answering that question, the first thing that I would ask you is, where do you live? What's the local incidence? What's the local prevalence of infection in your area? So there is no, I think, simple answer. And I think that's a really important observation, because we were asked earlier on, are lockdowns going to work? Well, lockdowns will not work in the current situation. What we're looking at now is a series of regionally specific outbreaks that, as we, if it is the case, get into an endemic equilibrium, the way we will get there is through a series of local outbreaks, which means that all the mitigation measures, whether they be sort of personal mitigation responses or those implemented by the directors of public health, are all going to be region and locality specific, possibly down to the level of local, lower level local authorities. So my question back to you is, how would you find out what the prevalence and incidence of infection is in your area, and what criteria would you use, or who would you ask in terms of, is it time to put masks on all the time when indoors? Or can we relax that and then step down the ladder, as you beautifully articulated in the question, just when somebody's in the room, or when I'm feeling ill? There are a number of different levels, and these are the sorts of questions everybody in the country is going to be asking. I'm going to be asking them for the next year, I would imagine. So they do need resolving.
Thank you. And I think Steve's pointed out that there is a new report out, I guess today, on the forms of support that are necessary to allow people to act in ways that keep themselves and others safe, even as the restrictions are lifted. I assume this is going to be on the IndySage website, Steve. Oh, you're still muted. There we go.
It's up there already.
It's up there already. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So that would be useful to follow on. Okay, well, we've come to the end, so we have to wrap up there. So as we end, I'd like to hand over then to Sir David for some final words.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think I'd like to just draw attention to 3 points. The first is, as reported by Kim, the rate of hospitalization of cases, so the rate of hospitalization compared with the number of cases, is constant at about 4% at the moment. perhaps coming down slowly, but was at 10% before some time ago. All I'm saying here is we've just got to be aware of the fact that we are not safe if we think that the number of cases per day isn't high. It is quite high and it is rising. But the second point is the concern we have about the global situation with vaccines and levels of infectivity. The availability of vaccines on the global scale is still very low. And we would love to see the Prime Minister changing his position, persuading the German Chancellor to change her position and support the waiving of IPR so that we can move on from this. It's in our own interest, if not only in the interest of those people in those countries. This virus, we know, mutates very quickly, and we're all potentially threatened by the emergence of mutations that may not be responsive to the vaccinations that we've received. And then finally, I think this point is critically important. We should not be learning to live with this disease. We should be separating those who have the disease and those who've been in touch with them from the rest of the population, which is the classic way of handling a pandemic. Once more, we just would like the Prime Minister to reconsider the position on the isolation with support of everyone who needs to be isolated so that the rest of us can get on safely with our business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir David. So thanks everyone for your questions. Thank you to everyone watching, whether you've been watching us live or catching up later. Thanks to everyone on the team, the amazing team of experts, sharing your expertise, listening to the concerns and questions and answering them so informatively. This sort of open communication is, of course, very, very vital. Just a reminder to people, all the reports from Independent Sage, including the new ones out today, are available on the website, along with the details of the whole team. Do follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, if you don't already, and we'll be back same time, same place, of course, virtually, next Friday. Stay safe, keep well, and thank you, everyone, again. Goodbye.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jim. That was great.